Welcome everyone. Today I will be sharing with you parts of my inquiry project, The Financial Crisis of 2008, specifically the findings and implications from my Communicating Mindfully course at Queen's University, Charlotte. We will be covering the purpose of the paper, some background, the findings from the film The Big Short, and the implications. My paper focused on how the financial industry created a guiding good of greed that changed how business was and thus created the economic crisis of 2008. I referenced the movie The Big Short, which is based on a true story, and used it to give examples of what occurred in the few years prior to the crisis. I showed how the organizational communication ethics, which is normally the movement and reactions that create positive in organizations, and how it got misdirected into the negative for society. The guiding good of the financial institutions and the rating agencies were focused purely on greed. Movies like The Big Short help us to understand what happened to create the financial crisis of 2008. Most of the characters in the movie were going to benefit from the egregious acts of many others who seemed to be clueless as to how fraudulent and corrupt the financial market had become. The communication ethic of the guiding good and that was being pursued was one of greed by the big corporations that make up the financial market. You see, in the 1930s, after the Great Depression, there had not been a financial crisis for over 40 years. The financial industry was tightly regulated, and most banks were locally owned businesses that lent their own money. Bond trading was not a money-making industry. Then, in the 1980s, the banks went public and deregulation began, and that what was once stable and safe began to change. Since the 1980s, the financial industries made more and more money. So the guiding good of being a service industry and helping those who were worthy of getting credit and helping people with their basic financial needs changed. What people found when they really looked at the housing market prior to the financial crisis of 2008 was that the mortgage-backed securities being sold were not the ones that had been originally created as truly safe investments of the 1970s. The concept of the mortgage-backed securities was first developed by Louis Ranieri when he worked at Salomon Brothers at Wall Street Investment Bank. The mortgage-backed securities were first designed so that the strong mortgages, those with people with high credit ratings or FICO scores, and a fixed-rate 30-year loans with substantial down payments, and were backed by the United States government. They bundled a bunch of these mortgages together and sold them to investors. These securities were rated with what the rating agency called AAA ratings, which are the highest that you can get. And investors would buy these bundles knowing that they would have a strong, safe investment. This was true until bonds became private. The industry then started making what were called subprime mortgages. These mortgages were made with much less creditworthiness and mainly on adjustable rate mortgages, meaning that the interest rates would fluctuate with the Federal Reserve rates and were generally short-term loans. They were 30-year amortized into a 1, 3, or 5-year due dates with a balloon payment at the end. The problem that happened besides the riskiness of the mortgages is that the banks also became publicly traded, which means that they now have stakeholders to account to and get really greedy. CDOs, or collateralized debt obligations, is a fancy way of saying that the investment banks would take bad bonds and repackage them and consider them diversified and would get them rated and resell them. This is where the problems began. With the mortgage-backed securities that Louis Ranieri started bundling, especially because they were safe and had a AAA rating from the rating agencies, which were designed to let investors know that their investments were safe and which ones were a bit riskier and with the lower ratings. For example, school retirement funds are not allowed to invest in anything less than AAA ratings from the rating agencies. Mortgage lenders started to make the subprime loans with high-risk borrowers for the fees they would get from the banks. They would get bonuses if they did adjustable rate mortgages, so they preferred them to the fixed rate loans. The business of communication ethics perspective of the behavior of the financial institutions prior to the economic crisis of 2008 looks at what Arnett, Fritz, and Bell state. Organizational communication ethics addresses the practices and functions of communication in organizations that protect and promote a particular good that defines a dwelling space. That's on page 140. The guiding good of the organization appears to have been greed, and that particular aspects were communicated to the different stakeholders. According to Collins and Porras in 2004, core values are essential that each organization gets to decide for itself what values it will hold independent of what the outside world dictates, as there is no real right way to set these values. Page 222. Once the organizations became corporations that had to report a bottom line increase of investments for the stakeholders, the motivation of the organization changed. The guiding good of a small organization that had ideals when it was formed changes when the bottom line was profits every quarter. The financial industry and the rating agencies were no different. According to Christian A. Conrad in 2010, why rating agencies, stock analysts, and auditors as the capital market watchdogs did not do their job and warn the investors about bad risk? The answer is that they had their own moral lapses, their scandals. That's on page 43. In the movie The Big Short, one of the main characters, that Mark Baum, meets with Georgia from Standard & Poor's, a rating agency, and they discussed why the agency hadn't downgraded the subprime bonds since the underlying were clearly deteriorating. Mr. Baum then asked if the agency in the past year had refused to rate any of the bonds at AAA percentage that the banks had wanted, and she at this time confessed that they did rate what the bank wanted, because if they didn't, they didn't do what the bank wanted, the bank would go down the street and get a rating that they wanted from a competitor, basically selling their ratings for fees. During the trials and depositions of the rating agencies, they stated that their ratings were, quote, only opinions, unquote. Unfortunately, people invested based on these false rating opinions. This is the guiding good of the organizations, and based on the temporal directions. According to Arnett, Fritz, and Bell in 2009, the unity of direction and change frames a direction as temporal. A given direction has a limited lifespan. Typically, a sense of direction goes unnoticed when all is going well in a company. Page 183. Everyone was doing it and making a lot of money. The media also played a part in the deception of how each organization got away without being questioned. According to Anthony Crawley in 2015, the inability for the agencies to have critical reflection created a system to work for smaller groups with self-interest, as well as groups such as the political and regulatory agencies for the good of greed and not for the good of everyone, that the media also played a part in this deception to the world. Page 14. The idea of the rich getting richer and serving those who had to know that these actions were there if they would only look, but no one wanted to. Also in the movie, when Mark Baum is talking to a CDO manager that works for a bank but gives investment advice to his clients, the conflict is that where he gets all his information that gets paid for, the advice was that had the leading edge. If the bank paid his commissions, packaged the CDOs, gave him the CDOs to sell, so whose interest was he really for? Was it really for the investor or was it for the bank? That is, in that point in the movie, Mr. Baum really feels that the world economy might actually collapse. Arnett, Fritz, and Bell in 2009 write, "The pragmatic public test is in the market itself, like an athletic contest. Business and professional communication ethics must meet the public testing," page 182. During these years of making large sums of money and everyone being able to buy a home and live the American dream, the public test was based on falsehoods. When everything is based on a lie, and CEOs and stakeholders and employees are making large sums of money, the guiding good of an organization seemed to be only the bottom line of making money at all costs. All of the mechanisms that had been set up to keep these kinds of events from happening were all doing the same thing, chasing the money. So the implications. If we do nothing and continue the way we are, we will have another crisis on our hands. Greed is a very hungry animal. We have taught our citizens to be entertained watching other people live their lives with all the glitz and the bling. People don't want to know what is going on in business and finance. It is either boring or over their heads and find it hard to follow and understand. I know that this is intentional. Those with the money don't want everyone to know what is happening and how it affects their lives. The communication ethics here is again the bottom line guiding good of greed. How can they just keep making more and more money? The idea that so much has changed and that the economic disparity is only growing and that literally the rich just keep getting richer and that people don't understand that the political system has been corrupted by the guiding good of greed as well. It is with the lobbyists that spend huge amounts of money and have a lot of influence in Washington that the deregulations ever happened. During the time that so much corruption was going on, if an auditor presented findings to the organization, they would have lawyers, and I mean plural, would argue with the auditor. If the auditors were really good, the banks would hire them. There are no real watchdogs anymore. Instead of the guiding good of trustworthiness and true value, it is the guiding good of greed that is being pursued. So if we don't implement major changes, we will be right where we are and right where we are going to where the global economy might just truly collapse. Well, that's pretty much what I have. Here are my references, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.